What does it mean when the men who survived the Pacific refuse to relive it on screen? 12 Pacific War movies. Veterans refuse to watch, because they are too accurate, isn't about spectacle or box office glory. It's about the rare films that cut too close to memory. The humidity, the fear, the silence before artillery, the moral weight of survival. Some veterans have praised these films for honesty. Others have quietly turned them off. Not because they're bad, because they remember too much. When this film reaches the ridge, it stops feeling like cinema and starts resembling testimony. The Okinawa sequences are not stylized hero shots framed for applause. They are chaotic, fragmented, and suffocating. The battlefield is mud, smoke, and torn earth. Limbs are mangled. Voices scream from unseen directions. Nothing feels stable. Veterans of Pacific Ridge combat have often described the terrain as an enemy of its own. Steep coral cliffs, open exposure, nowhere to hide once the barrage begins. The film captures that helpless verticality. Soldiers climb into fire. They slide back down into blood. The sky offers no comfort. What unsettles many former servicemen isn't simply the violence, it's the confusion. Orders become distant echoes. Visibility shrinks to a few feet. A comrade beside you vanishes in dust. The movie refuses to provide clean geography or heroic clarity. Instead, it mirrors the disorientation Marines have described in oral histories. The sound design adds to the strain. Explosions don't arrive theatrically. They rupture the scene without warning. Rifle shots crack sharply, not rhythmically. There is no swelling score to cushion impact. Combat feels abrupt and indifferent. The wounded are not romanticized. They are broken, crying for morphine, pleading not to be left behind. That detail, the fear of abandonment, is one veterans have repeatedly mentioned when recounting Okinawa. The film lingers on that anxiety. It doesn't cut away politely. Even the pauses feel heavy. After the charge subsides, the battlefield becomes eerily quiet. Bodies remain where they fell. Smoke drifts lazily over devastation. That stillness mirrors the aftermath many Pacific veterans struggled to describe. Not triumph, not relief, just numbness. For some who fought in the Pacific, the ridge scenes reopened memories of relentless artillery and close-quarters combat that offered no clear front line. The enemy was hidden in caves. Fire came from above and below. There was rarely a sense of control. The movie's realism has been praised by military historians for reflecting documented Okinawa conditions. Yet that same accuracy makes it difficult viewing. Several veterans have commented that while they respect its authenticity, they cannot endure repeat screenings. Because it does not glamorize survival. It forces the audience to sit with cost. And for those who were actually there, that cost is not entertainment. This film unsettles veterans in a different way. It does not overwhelm with chaos alone. It disarms through humanity. By telling the story from the Japanese perspective, the film strips away the simplicity of enemy and replaces it with individuals, soldiers writing letters home, officers debating impossible strategies, young men trying to delay the inevitable. For American veterans who fought on Iwo Jima, this perspective can be deeply unsettling. Combat on Iwo Jima was defined by hidden fortifications and relentless resistance. Marines advanced across black volcanic sand under constant fire from unseen positions. The film reconstructs that tactical reality with precision. Bunkers are interconnected. Artillery is calculated. Retreat is not an option. What makes it painful for some veterans is the emotional framing. The defenders are not caricatures. They are disciplined, exhausted, and aware that survival is unlikely. That complexity forces viewers to confront the mutual desperation of both sides. The underground tunnels are filmed with oppressive tightness. Air feels scarce, or lantern light flickers against concrete walls. Orders echo in confined darkness. Veterans who encountered those subterranean networks have described similar claustrophobia, the sense of fighting ghosts within the earth. Gunfire erupts suddenly from narrow openings, Grenades bounce unpredictably through corridors. The film refuses to make combat symmetrical or cinematic. It feels abrupt and unfair. The volcanic terrain is portrayed accurately. Soft sand that swallows boots, no vegetation for cover, an island stripped bare by bombardment. Marines who landed there spoke of exhaustion before they even reached defensive lines. The movie reflects that draining advance. Perhaps most affecting is the inevitability. Officers know the battle cannot be won. Soldiers still carry out orders. That resignation resonates with veterans who understood that certain Pacific battles were fought at terrible cost for strategic necessity. Some American veterans have expressed respect for the film's restraint and historical care. Others have said it is too difficult to watch because it humanizes men they once fought in brutal close-quarters conditions. Not out of hatred, but because it reopens memories of how personal that combat felt. There is no triumphant ending. There is no comforting moral speech. Only letters buried in sand. Only the silence after artillery. For veterans, that silence can be louder than any explosion. This series does not move like a traditional war film. It lingers. It exhausts. It follows men not just into battle, but into sickness, boredom, terror, and psychological unraveling. For many Marine veterans of the Pacific Theater, that pacing feels uncomfortably familiar. From Guadalcanal to Peleliu to Okinawa, the series avoids heroic framing. The jungle is not picturesque. It is oppressive. Rain never seems to stop. Uniforms cling to skin. Mosquitoes swarm without mercy. Soldiers do not look like clean-cut archetypes. They look hollowed out. Veterans have often described the Pacific Campaign as a war of erosion rather than momentum. Months of attrition, malaria, dysentery, heat rash, sleep deprivation. The show depicts those realities without apology. Combat is not constant glory. It is long waiting interrupted by sudden terror. When firefights erupt, they feel disorganized and frighteningly intimate. Enemy positions are concealed in foliage or carved into ridge lines. Marines advance uncertainly, scanning tree lines that appear still one moment and erupt with gunfire the next. The series captures that invisible threat, the feeling of being watched by an enemy you cannot see. One of the most difficult elements for veterans is the emotional aftermath. The series shows men returning home altered beyond recognition. They sit at dinner tables unable to describe what they witnessed. They struggle with noise. They feel detached from ordinary life. That portrayal aligns closely with documented post-war testimony. The psychological toll is not dramatized with speeches. It appears in small gestures, trembling hands, distant eyes, sudden silence. Veterans have remarked that those quiet details reflect what many carried for decades. The brutality is not stylized. Bodies are not framed heroically. The dead remain in awkward, unsettling positions. There is mud on everything. The camera rarely looks away quickly. That restraint deepens the impact. Perhaps what makes the series hardest to revisit is its cumulative weight. Episode after episode, the environment grinds soldiers down. There is no decisive, uplifting turning point. There is only endurance. For some veterans, watching it feels less like entertainment and more like reopening a field journal they tried to close. It does not exaggerate. It remembers. And that remembrance can be heavy. Unlike most war films, this one whispers instead of shouts. Yet beneath its philosophical narration lies a depiction of Guadalcanal combat that many veterans have described as hauntingly authentic. The film avoids rigid narrative structure. It drifts between internal monologues and sudden violence. That fragmentation mirrors how memory often returns, not in linear order, but in flashes. The assault on the hill is filmed with painful patience. Soldiers move through tall grass under a blazing sun. They do not sprint heroically. They inch forward. Sweat drips into their eyes. Every step feels exposed. Veterans of jungle warfare have spoken about that vulnerability, the knowledge that concealment can vanish instantly. When gunfire begins, it is chaotic and disorienting. Men fall without dramatic buildup. Shouts overlap. Commands are lost in confusion. The camera does not create tidy lines of battle. It captures scattered panic. The environment feels alive and indifferent. Birds scatter at explosions. Grass sways in wind moments after artillery strikes. Nature does not react emotionally. It continues. That contrast between beauty and brutality unsettles many who fought in similar landscapes. The film also confronts moral strain. Officers debate orders that will cost lives. Soldiers question authority internally but obey outwardly. Veterans have often reflected on that tension, duty versus doubt, especially during prolonged campaigns like Guadalcanal. There are no triumphant speeches after the hill is taken. There is exhaustion. There is grief. There is the quiet recognition that another hill waits beyond the next ridge. What disturbs some veterans most is the interiority. The voiceovers explore fear, love, resentment, and confusion. Combat is shown not only as physical danger but as a fracture within the self. And that psychological dimension resonates deeply with those who carried unseen wounds long after the war ended. The movie does not attempt to simplify the Pacific conflict into clear-cut heroics. It presents men caught inside forces larger than themselves. Strategy, politics, survival. For viewers seeking action spectacle, it can feel slow. For veterans who remember the waiting, the heat, the uncertainty, it can feel almost too precise. It does not celebrate. It contemplates. And contemplation can be harder than chaos. This film does not focus solely on the firefight. It examines what happens after the photograph, after the flag is raised, after the image becomes myth. For veterans of Iwo Jima, that shift from battlefield to home front can feel painfully accurate. The combat sequences are harsh and immediate. Black sand swallows boots. Machine gun fire cuts across open ground without warning. Marines advance through smoke not knowing whether the next step will be their last. The film's depiction of the landing avoids glamour. It shows confusion, stalled momentum, and relentless resistance. Yet the deeper discomfort lies beyond the beach. Survivors are brought back to America to sell war bonds. They are paraded across stages, asked to smile beneath bright lights, and introduced as symbols rather than men. Veterans who returned home to applause while carrying private trauma have often described a similar dissonance. Public celebration did not erase memory. The film portrays survivors' guilt with restraint. Those who lived through the battle wrestle quietly with the knowledge that others did not. Applause feels misplaced. Praise feels heavy. That emotional layering resonates with documented accounts from Pacific veterans who struggled to reconcile hero narratives with the chaos they experienced. Flashbacks interrupt domestic scenes. A ballroom fades into artillery smoke. Laughter is replaced by the echo of gunfire. The transitions feel abrupt and intrusive, much like intrusive memories veterans have described decades after service. The political machinery behind wartime imagery is also explored carefully. Decisions are made about which stories to amplify and which to suppress. The complexity of truth becomes blurred by necessity. Veterans have spoken about the tension between propaganda and lived experience, and the film addresses that divide without overt commentary. Even the raising of the flag is portrayed with uncertainty. It is not framed as a triumphant climax. It is a fleeting moment amid exhaustion and fear. The camera does not linger sentimentally. It observes. For some veterans, the most difficult aspect is the portrayal of returning home. Civilians ask simplistic questions. They want clean narratives. They struggle to comprehend what the men endured. That disconnect mirrors countless post-war testimonies. The film does not accuse or condemn. It simply reveals the distance between myth and memory. For those who were there, that distance can feel unsettling, because the photograph froze a moment, but it never captured the cost. Unlike many war films, this one adopts a procedural tone. It reconstructs the events leading to Pearl Harbor with methodical precision. For veterans who witnessed that morning, its restraint can be unexpectedly intense. The film does not rush toward spectacle. It builds gradually, showing miscommunications, delayed messages, and bureaucratic hesitation. The sense of inevitability grows quietly. Viewers understand that warnings exist, but they are not fully acted upon. That creeping awareness mirrors historical records of the attack's buildup. When the planes finally arrive, the violence feels sudden and disorienting. Bombs fall without dramatic prelude. Battleships ignite in towering columns of flame. Sailors scramble across decks coated in oil and debris. There is no romantic framing of destruction. The attack unfolds from multiple perspectives. American servicemen react with confusion. Japanese pilots carry out meticulously planned strikes. The film avoids caricature. It presents both sides as professionals executing orders within complex systems. Veterans who survived Pearl Harbor have often remarked on the chaos of those first minutes. Sirens overlapping, commands shouted across smoke, uncertainty about whether it was a drill. The film captures that confusion rather than simplifying it. Aircraft dive steeply toward anchored ships. Explosions rupture steel hulls. Water churns with burning fuel. The imagery remains stark and observational. There is little musical manipulation guiding emotion. Perhaps most striking is the aftermath. Damaged vessels list heavily in the harbor. Survivors stand in stunned silence. The camera lingers on wreckage rather than victory. For some veterans, the accuracy of the reconstruction can reopen memories long buried. The methodical buildup makes the attack feel personal rather than distant. It was not random chaos. It was a chain of missed signals culminating in catastrophe. The film does not glorify retaliation. It ends in reflection. And reflection can be harder than action, because it forces viewers to sit with what was lost before the war truly began. Produced only a few years after the war, this film carries an immediacy rare in later depictions. Many of the extras were actual Marines who had fought in the Pacific. Their presence lends a weight that scripted performance alone cannot replicate. The boot camp sequences emphasize discipline and endurance. Recruits are pushed relentlessly. The training feels harsh, not theatrical. And veterans who experience similar preparation have often acknowledged its authenticity. When the narrative shifts to combat, the tone remains grounded. The landing at Iwo Jima is portrayed with controlled realism for its era. Smoke drifts across the beach. Troops advance cautiously. The danger feels tangible rather than stylized. The volcanic terrain is recreated with attention to detail. Dark sand stretches without cover. Defensive positions loom ahead. Marines move in coordinated lines, aware that each step exposes them to unseen fire. What distinguishes this film is its proximity to lived experience. It was created at a time when memories were fresh. The cultural distance between audience and event was minimal. For veterans watching shortly after returning home, the images may have felt less like fiction and more like documentation. The character arcs avoid excessive sentimentality. Leadership is portrayed as firm and demanding. Losses occur without elaborate speeches. The tone remains measured. For some veterans, revisiting the film decades later can feel like reopening an early chapter of collective memory. It reflects how the war was framed soon after it ended, with pride but also with acknowledgement of sacrifice. The realism is restrained by the filmmaking style of its time. Graphic detail is limited compared to modern productions, yet emotional authenticity remains evident, because those involved understood what had happened. They did not need embellishment. They remembered clearly, and that clarity still resonates. This film does not center on a battlefield charge. It concentrates on endurance, the slow erosion of body and spirit inside a prisoner of war camp. For veterans who survived Japanese captivity in the Pacific, that focus can be profoundly difficult to revisit. The early sequences over open ocean are tense but brief. The true weight of the story settles once captivity begins. Barbed wire replaces horizon lines. Wooden barracks replace sky. Hunger becomes constant rather than dramatic. The film portrays forced labor, malnutrition, and systematic humiliation without theatrical exaggeration. Guards assert dominance through routine cruelty rather than explosive violence. That repetition reflects documented POW accounts describing captivity as a grinding daily ordeal rather than a single catastrophic event. Winter scenes feel especially stark. Prisoners shiver in thin clothing. Breath hangs in cold air. Food portions shrink to near invisibility. The camera does not hurry past these details. It observes them with restraint. For many veterans, what lingers most from captivity was not a single act of brutality, but the steady stripping away of identity. The film captures that erosion through silence. Conversations become sparse. Faces grow hollow. Hope flickers uncertainly. One recurring image, a prisoner forced to hold a heavy object above his head while guards watch, illustrates psychological pressure more than spectacle. The moment stretches uncomfortably. The humiliation is deliberate. Veterans who endured similar punishments have described that combination of exhaustion and public degradation as deeply scarring. The film avoids turning survival into a triumphant montage. Liberation arrives without fireworks. Freedom is complicated by lingering trauma. The end of imprisonment does not erase memory. For some former POWs and their families, watching the film can reopen generational pain. It validates suffering long minimized, yet it also makes that suffering visible again. The portrayal is sober rather than sensational, and that sobriety can feel closer to truth than comfort. Set in a Japanese prison camp during the construction of the Burma Railway, this film examines captivity from a collective perspective. It focuses on moral conflict as much as physical hardship. For veterans who endured forced labor in Southeast Asia, its atmosphere can be unsettlingly accurate. The jungle environment is oppressive. Humidity hangs heavy. Disease spreads quickly. Men collapse under the strain of exhaustion. The railway itself becomes a symbol of relentless demand, track laid through mud, rock, and despair. Unlike films driven by explosive combat, this narrative builds tension through deprivation. Food is scarce. Medical supplies are almost non-existent. Guards enforce discipline with unpredictable severity. The threat is constant, even in moments of quiet. Prisoners debate cooperation versus resistance. Some argue survival requires compromise. Others insist on maintaining principle despite punishment. That moral strain reflects documented POW testimony where decisions carried weight beyond immediate comfort. The film portrays illness with blunt realism. Bodies weaken visibly. Skin tightens against bone. Fever spreads through cramped quarters. The absence of spectacle makes these scenes harder to dismiss. And for veterans who experienced captivity in Asia, the psychological component may be most difficult. The loss of control, the dependence on captors for basic needs, the uncertainty of release. Those elements are depicted without melodrama. Even acts of resilience are quiet, a shared prayer, a whispered conversation, a brief smile in darkness. The film does not inflate these gestures into grand triumphs. It presents them as fragile defenses against despair. The railway construction sequences emphasize repetition. Hammer, lift, place, repeat, under guard, under threat. That monotony mirrors historical accounts of forced labor designed to exhaust rather than simply punish. Some veterans have expressed appreciation for the film's refusal to simplify captivity into clear heroes and villains. It portrays individuals trapped within systems shaped by war. There is no grand battlefield climax, only endurance, and endurance can leave scars long after chains are removed. This film narrows the scope to two men stranded on a deserted island, one American, one Japanese. There are no large-scale battles, no supporting cast, just isolation. For veterans who fought in the Pacific, the simplicity of the premise can feel unexpectedly powerful. Many describe the theater as vast and isolating, with small units cut off from clear lines of communication. The film reflects that loneliness. The island setting is unforgiving. Sun beats down relentlessly. Fresh water is scarce. Food requires effort to obtain. The environment is not romanticized, it is indifferent. At first, the two soldiers view each other solely as enemies. Suspicion governs every movement. Weapons are held close. Sleep is cautious. That mistrust echoes the intensity of Pacific combat, where surrender was rare and caution constant. Gradually, necessity forces uneasy cooperation. Survival outweighs ideology. They build shelter, they share labor. The film avoids sentimental transformation. Trust develops slowly, imperfectly. For some veterans, that portrayal of reluctant coexistence resonates deeply. Many later reflected on the humanity of opponents encountered in brutal circumstances. The film's quiet acknowledgement of shared vulnerability can stir complicated emotions. Dialogue is sparse. Silence dominates. Wind replaces orchestral score. The absence of large-scale combat shifts focus to psychological endurance. The island becomes a metaphor for isolation experienced by many servicemen after returning home, stranded between memory and normalcy, suspended between identity and expectation. The film's climax is restrained rather than explosive. Its power lies in what remains unsaid. For veterans, watching two former enemies navigate survival without rhetoric can reopen reflections on the personal nature of war. Not hatred, not spectacle, just two men shaped by forces larger than themselves. And sometimes that intimacy feels closer to memory than any battlefield reconstruction. This film centers on the Navajo code talkers during the Battle of Saipan, but beneath the action framework lies something more unsettling: the moral burden placed on individual soldiers. For veterans of the Pacific Theater, especially those who fought in close-quarters island battles, certain sequences feel sharply familiar. The opening assault does not unfold with polished choreography. Gunfire erupts from fortified positions carved into coral ridges. Mortar shells detonate without warning. Marines advance across exposed terrain knowing concealment is minimal. The film captures the relentless tempo of island warfare, the sense that once the advance begins, stopping is not an option. Saipan was marked by brutal fighting against deeply entrenched defenses. The movie recreates tunnel systems, concealed bunkers, and sudden counterattacks emerging from hidden openings. That unpredictability reflects documented Marine accounts describing combat where the enemy seemed to rise from the earth itself. What makes the film particularly difficult for some veterans is the ethical tension woven into the narrative. The responsibility to protect the code at all costs introduces a chilling dimension. Orders are not merely tactical, they are existential. The weight of that obligation mirrors the heavy decisions soldiers sometimes faced under extreme conditions. Explosions do not feel decorative. They rupture space violently. Bodies fall abruptly. The chaos lacks cinematic rhythm. Scenes are frequently disorienting, with smoke and debris obscuring orientation. Veterans who experience similar battlefield confusion have often emphasized how little clarity existed once engagement began. The terrain itself is hostile. Sharp rock tears at boots. Heat presses downward. Movement requires effort. The film avoids framing the island as exotic. It is harsh and unforgiving. Moments of camaraderie are understated. There are brief exchanges, small glances, shared fatigue. Those fragments of connection stand in contrast to the violence surrounding them. That balance reflects many first-hand testimonies describing the importance of unit bonds in sustaining morale. For some veterans, the portrayal resonates not because it is flawless, but because it attempts to convey the layered pressures of Pacific combat, physical danger intertwined with strategic responsibility. It does not treat battle as spectacle. It portrays it as obligation, and obligation can weigh heavily long after the shooting stops. Produced during the war itself, this film occupies a unique place in Pacific War cinema. Created while the conflict was ongoing, it drew directly from early reports of the Guadalcanal campaign. For veterans who fought there, its proximity to real events gives it an unusual gravity. The jungle is dense and oppressive. Rain falls frequently. Mud clings to boots. Soldiers move cautiously through thick vegetation, aware that visibility is limited and danger is concealed. The environment is not merely a backdrop. It shapes every decision. Unlike later films that benefit from historical hindsight, this production reflects the uncertainty of its moment. Outcomes were not yet fully known. The war was still unfolding. That immediacy lends authenticity to its tone. Combat sequences are restrained by the filmmaking techniques of the era, yet they carry a sober realism. Gunfire cracks sharply. Troops advance with visible caution. That casualties occur without elaborate dramatization. The film avoids exaggerated heroics. What resonates most for some veterans is the portrayal of endurance. Guadalcanal was not a swift campaign. It was prolonged, exhausting, and defined by attrition. The movie acknowledges fatigue. It shows men sweating under relentless heat, wading through long stretches of tension punctuated by sudden firefights. Conversations between soldiers feel grounded rather than theatrical. There is apprehension beneath outward confidence. That subtle tension mirrors accounts from Marines who described constant vigilance in jungle terrain. The film also reflects the mindset of servicemen at the time, determination mixed with uncertainty. There is resolve, but not triumphalism. The tone remains steady. For veterans who experienced Guadalcanal firsthand, watching a depiction made so soon after the events can feel like revisiting a chapter that was never fully closed. It is not graphic by modern standards. It does not rely on spectacle. Its power lies in its closeness to lived memory, because it was created while those memories were still raw. And sometimes the earliest portrayals are the hardest to face. These films endure because they refuse to soften history. They reconstruct terrain, tension, and moral strain with care rather than spectacle. For some veterans, that accuracy honors memory. For others, it reopens it. Either way, these stories remind us that the Pacific War was not cinematic legend. It was lived reality, and reality does not fade easily.